Welcome everyone to our a new Krishna West program that we'll be having every Thursday. It will take different forms depending on the person who is facilitating. But today we're lucky to have Pradyumna with us. He is traveling to visit his family back in Chile in a few weeks. So we were able to nab him before he flies off. Pradyumna will be speaking on the topic of Krishna consciousness as a science. Let me give a little background on Pradyumna first, for those of you who may not know him. I've known Pradyumna for a few years. He's a key member of our Krishna West team here, and he's been helping us from the very beginning, distributing flyers and delivering presentations at universities all those years ago. If I'm right, I think I'm right, Pradyumna was practicing Krishna consciousness from childhood. So he is a wealthy resource of information and experiences about Krishna consciousness. And I would invite anyone who has any questions during the course of the event to take the opportunity to ask him his views or opinions on anything related to the topics of Krishna consciousness as a science or anything else. So I think I'm just gonna end it there. I don't want to take up too much time. As a reminder for those of you on Zoom, if you have a question and you're a bit shy to ask it on video, just pop it into the chat and I'll pick it up on your behalf. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Pradyumna, and maybe he can say a few words just to kick us off, Pradyumna. This will be a question and answer format, but maybe you can say a few words about this notion that we always hear about in communities of devotees, that Krishna consciousness, or the process of Krishna consciousness, is like a science. Perhaps you could say a few words about what we mean by that.
Oh, now on the big screen. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share a little bit. So hopefully whatever I can convey, whatever I can communicate is helpful for you. I think that this is it can be a very difficult question, because in a way we are coming from different worlds. We're coming from different worlds. We have we can say, very ancient world in which all this philosophy, all this literature has been, let's say, proposed. And we have in the opposition our modern world, let's say, in which looks like the values, looks like the objectives are completely different. So it looks like that there is a clash over there between these two things. But like as you were saying, like myself growing up around this type of knowledge, around this philosophy, around in a more broader sense, this culture, it obviously makes you ask. It makes me ask along all this time, I ask myself, how can you try to understand both sides without having to live like with a broken mind? Some sort of kind of thinking that, okay, this is in a particular situation, you behave and you act like this, and there is a completely different context where you have to transform or completely leave your other mind aside and start to think in a particular way. So I think that was one of I think that my own experience, that was one of the initial struggles, let's say. So for me, I think that the possibility to try to build a bridge between these two things is fundamental. And it's fundamental also in the sense of the kind of things that we can obtain, the kind of things that we can achieve. Like, what are we winning by having a spiritual science at all? And we can ask, what do we win by having science at all? Like, we can actually ask that question first. So like science in the broadest sense is just trying to understand the world, describe the world in a way that it's not something completely foreign. Yeah. Once you know something, you can interact with that thing also in a better way. Okay. So to have knowledge in any realm from human relationships to, in this case, to how we relate with the universe, is basically having knowledge about the other side. So in a way that we can actually have a harmonious, a sustainable interaction. So in this case, science, we can say that is basically gathering or acquiring how the universe behaves, how the universe is in a way interacting with us, what we can obtain, what we can see, or what we can, what's the nature of that interaction in the end. So that's a relationship, we can say. So knowledge in the end has that relationship nature, we can say. But what is adding, in this case, the particular prefix, in this case, of a spiritual? We're using a spiritual in this case. What is referring, actually? And I think that in this case, we also can start to ask ourselves, what means the spiritual in the broadest sense? Like if you take it, not a spiritual, if you speak anyone about what means a spiritual, or what's the commonality of, or generality of what is someone referring to when is saying this is something that is a spiritual. I think that maybe we can argue about this later, and we can try to construct something more precise. But I think that one of the common things and in starting points, we can say, to understanding something as a spiritual is understanding how the things work together, how the things, despite all the varieties that we observe, that we perceive, or how the things are one in the end, how the things are together, despite all those differences. So in that sense, we can elaborate on that, elaborate a spiritual as that knowledge, let's say, or that kind of different aspects that allow us to understand how the varieties in the end, how the multiple parts that we can observe around us, in the end, all together join and make a one, or join and act, or in this harmonic way. Yeah. So in that sense, we can understand a spiritual like that. And actually, if you go and we check in the Bhagavad-gita, that is the main source, we can say, for in this case for this type of spiritual inquiries in the Vedic tradition. We can also see over there, like, how it is described or how it is defined knowledge is going to be according to, in a way, to what are the objectives of the individual, what are the objectives of the person. And one of the divisions or definitions, better say, of knowledge that is given is that knowledge in this mood of that is mentioned here, sattva, this mood of trying to understand the world, but in a way that, despite the varieties, you're capable of getting and putting all together the pieces as a whole, as a one thing. Despite the varieties, there is one thing that remains, and the one thing that is in the basis of everything. And knowledge that led you through that path, that leads you to that objective of understanding that one thing. That's one type of knowledge. But the other, actually, in the same Bhagavad-gita, is described that there is other, or people, depending on the objectives that they have, they can also see knowledge on the other perspective, and see actually things as different parts, see things as disgregated, see the things as separated. And in that case, is specifically talking about the bodies, and see how we are all different, and see that identify the true self as the bodies, the different shapes, the different characteristics that every one of us has. But in this case, we can apply that same principle of disgregating things, of separating things, to how we study or how we understand the rest of the universe. And from that perspective, science is fulfilling another role, not the role of putting all together, but the role of how we can separate. And why this is important? Because through the way of separation is that you can have control. And from that other perspective, then, knowledge means, what can I use, or how can I gather knowledge, information that eventually is going to help me put these things together to in a way to control them, to exploit them, to create them, let's say. So if you can take like one example of that perspective, for example, you have this physicist Feynman. He was describing that whatever I cannot create, whatever I cannot create, I don't really understand. Because to really understand something, you should be able to manipulate it, to build it up, to construct it. So from that perspective, knowledge are the things that we can touch in the end. Knowledge are the things that you, through those different through the operating over the different features of those objects, you can manipulate them. You can control them in the end. So in this case, we can see that, at least as in the Bhagavad-gita is being presented, what is knowledge is going to be intimately linked to what's the objective that we have behind. So in that sense, what we understand, and this is a historical perspective that I'm sure there's people that can do much better than me, but from a historical perspective, what we are nowadays calling science, I think that is linked to that second view. That is, we acknowledge something that as knowledge when we can manipulate it, when we can touch it using this, let's say this, our senses, and we can assume, we can consider all these different instruments, telescopes, microscopes, and so on, as extensions from our own already innate capacities of sensorial experience, of perception. So in that sense, it's important to try to understand to what we are referring when we are talking or when we are using these words, because historically, and in this case, depending on these different sources, the kind of things or the accuracy of what we are talking about is maybe it's not. The point is that maybe we are not talking about exactly the same thing. So it's important to be able to identify these definitions in this case. So, but starting from that, yeah, definitely we can say in the Bhagavad-gita, there is a system of defining and schematizing knowledge, and you're again generating categories and describing different parts and different and this process through a process that is useful to reach that other objective of trying to understand things as a one, and how all that variety in the end is operating as a one in the end. Yeah. Sorry, I maybe I have been rambling a little bit. So, yeah, I don't know if there's some other things that you want to add. Or...
No, that's great, Prady, for the intro to the session. I should have mentioned earlier that we're aiming to extend the Q&A until 8:30 p.m. So we've still got another 40 minutes. So please gather your questions, and we'll pace. Pradyumna will be able to pace his answers so that he can cover as many of them as possible. But we've had one come through from Labdi, and I will unmute Labdi so that she can ask it herself.
Thank you.
Hello, thank
Hello.
you. So I don't have a lot of experience and knowledge regarding this. I was just curious, so I entered this like Zoom meeting, and it's really interesting. Two questions I had was science is all to do with facts and like proving theories, and like if science is more to do with having a theory and actually proving it with evidence, and how would Krishna consciousness be related to that? Because isn't the fundamental like belief of Krishna consciousness that we believe that God exists, but we don't have any evidence that God exists? So how would we say that Krishna consciousness is a science? Mm-hmm. And another question I had was that the Bhagavad-gita, it's a text, and I actually don't know who's written it, but I do know that it was by like a human or person. So wouldn't that also be a biased text? Like it doesn't contain any accurate information or anything. So we don't, and science is all about facts. So how would you say that the Bhagavad-gita is scientific in a way, or it's to do with Krishna consciousness that is considered as a science? I don't know if my questions made sense, sorry.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense.
Thank
It
you.
makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the whole point in the end, because that's in a way, because yeah, is because when we talk about facts in this case, basically fact by definition is something that can be acquired through your senses. Yeah, that's the underlying assumption in that case. The like they say, the unit of knowledge in this case, that let's say that that's a fact. To be defined as a fact, it has to be something that by definition it has to be capable of be at least through the definition of the empirical science, is something that it needs to be possible to be touched, as you were saying. So in that sense, yeah, by definition, we can say that if we define facts like that, of course, it's impossible to touch, let's say, or to grasp something like, in your case, you were saying that it's impossible. It would be impossible to prove through that or get a fact that God exists. In that sense, that considering fact that as that kind of nature of uncovering something or englobing something, when by definition, in this case, we can say that God is exactly the opposite thing, that you cannot completely cover it in the end. But in this case, I will say that in the Bhagavad Gita itself, you cannot have completely and a full covering of that absolute truth, as is mentioned, but still you can acknowledge that something like that has to exist, and maybe and that's why it's interesting why specifically, and I'm referring in this case to Bhagavad Gita translation by Prabhupada. He uses to refer to God, in this case to Krishna, he uses this term that is much linked to the philosophical tradition in the West, we can say, that is actually this absolute truth. Yeah, why it goes so like something that sounds so technical to describe it. But absolute truth in this case is, again, we can say that going to what we were talking about, this idea that the world, in the end, there is one thing that makes it all function together. So it's not all variety. So in that sense, from that perspective, one of the assumptions that we need to do, even before being able to create any facts, is that those facts will lead us to some truth. We cannot prove that in the end there is a truth, but we have the assumption, even through that process of gathering facts, is that eventually those facts will tell you something about a truth, that behind the phenomena that you observe, I don't know, biological, physical, etc., around all those facts, there is a truth. There is something that is generating those facts, let's say. So in this case, as we were saying, you cannot generate a fact from that nature that will be able to cover that entire, that big concept of the absolute truth. But through the different, in this case, what is being mentioned here, that you can have some insight about the necessity that a truth exists. And actually, you can say that if if you want to, if any knowledge is going to exist, any knowledge exists at all, there you need to have a truth, at least one thing at least has to be true in the end behind everything. So in this case, we can refer to God at the in this case as an initial understanding, at least as this only thing that has to be true, in a way that other things can be true, in a way that I can't say anything about anything. At least one thing has to be true to be possible to have knowledge at all. Because if not, then knowledge doesn't make sense. And therefore, the facts don't make sense if there is nothing behind. So in this case, yeah, it is acknowledged, again, going back to the point in the Vedas, is acknowledged that this idea of the supreme of God is beyond this, again, by definition, is beyond that possibility. But still, through the workings of the world, through the workings of the different parts, you can have some sort of glimpse. So for example, there's this big description of looking at the entire universe as a manifestation of that supreme energy, let's say. And that's an approach, because in a way you see that the universe itself is working as a whole. Still, despite you don't know, but still you see that the universe is working as a whole. And because that assumption that there is something behind that structure of the universe is that science at all makes sense, that you can say that there is rule of physics, and that you can say that there is some laws of thermodynamics, because in the end you're assuming that, okay, there is something behind that maybe we cannot see, because all the things that we can see are just all these varieties, all these different things that are shifting and mutating and changing all the time. But the thing is that through that all varieties that you're always observing, you're saying, okay, but something is generating that behind. So we can say, yeah, that's laws of physics. And you propose this structure, and we can say gravity, and you can propose gravity, and gravity is there. But in the end, you don't see gravity. You see gravity through the interactions and through the consequences, let's say, of that process. So in this case, we can say we cannot see the primordial principle directly, at least through our capacities, but still you can have an intuition. And in this case, that objective, as we were talking about at the beginning, that objective that, okay, you have the intuition that there is something that is making all the things hold up. So that's, we can say, even that idea that there is something holding up the universe, you can say that is an initial spiritual part of a spiritual understanding. Yeah. And I think that if you go and check in the Bhagavad-gita, for example, in the Bhagavatam also, you see traces. You see also that path a little bit delineated, and you have this description of Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan. That you have different features of how we can say we experience reality in a way. And those different features are encapsulated in different aspects of how we can experience things. And the first thing that we experience is that the things exist. Things are there. The universe is there, and we can have a perception at all. There is an existence. That's the first thing. So in this case, that I think that, yeah, like just trying to run that is not going to keep talking for hours. But this, in the end, yeah, like you can have this, like in any path, at the beginning, you don't see the ending point, but at least you see the beginning of the path. And then in the measure that you are moving through it, you start to have different perspectives. But at the beginning, at least you have to see the beginning of the path. So that's one thing. But another big question over there is why is worthy to go to, from that perspective, why is worthy to try to approach, to go till the final objective? Because in this case, in many, as we can say, we can say in this case that why is worthy to follow, let's say, this spiritual process, or why is worthy to see the world as a one thing? And in this case, you can say that it's also arising from your own perspective. You can say your own needs, and we have your own needs, and we our own way of looking at the world. And in this case, that look for this connection in the end, you can see it through and many different ways. So yeah, I think that's a big other topic, but I'm deviating from your question. So maybe we can elaborate on that later. But about the second point about this, the Bhagavad-gita as something written by people in this case, and that it will be biased. Well, in this case, I think that certainly you can say, that through this knowledge, and any knowledge, when you want to acquire it, you are getting it through people in the end that are holding that knowledge. So you go to university and you study any topic from a professor in the end. So in that case, the fact that you're studying from a human, not necessarily and completely makes impossible to tackle the search of knowledge. What's the word? It's not completely excludes. It doesn't completely excludes the possibility of getting knowledge there. The fact that it's biased, and in this case, we know that, as you were mentioning, that we are getting the knowledge. Yeah, no, is through the different masters and through the different people, different teachers that are sharing it. So in that way, we can say that it's a live knowledge in the end. It's a live thing. So from that perspective, yeah, the idea of that, and actually the idea of the process, we can say, as is described in the Bhagavad-gita, is that you are capable through these through different processes that are presented in the yogic method, in the yoga path, is that you're able to, first of all, acknowledge your biases. And actually, we can say that one of the initial, at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, is actually Krishna stating that, yeah, because you have this vision that you think like you are the body, you are subjected to those biases by default. And actually, we can acknowledge that because we are identifying with these bodies. I'm thinking I'm a Chilean guy, 30 years old. Right now, yeah, I'm just waiting for a bit to go in this trip. And I have this whole psychology. And obviously, I will have this bias with myself. I will have this bias with myself. But the idea here is that through the process of, in this case, being able to distill and being able to get to understand better the knowledge, you are capable of getting rid of those, or at least acknowledging, or at least being able to overcome those biases. So, and the knowledge in that sense, you're talking in this case, I think to the text, like the text as something that could be flawed, let's say. But in this case, we also we can see in which way the knowledge is being transmitted. And in this case, you can see that on one hand, you have the text over there, like written words. But on the other hand, you also have again, those same teachers that on one hand are not just passively transmitting the knowledge, but also living the knowledge. So in that way, they are showing at the same time. It's like in the same way that we have a science, or a science in theory or insight. That, yeah, you can say that any theory in the end is just something written by a scientist. And if I am not a proper scientist, I have no way of testing, and I can say that, yeah, that theory is biased. But the thing is that the theory will become something that, as you were saying, is a scientific fact. Is that myself, I take first of all, you can go and if you check how science works, science works because there is a lot of people that is doing the same thing, and a lot of people is testing the thing at the same time to say, okay, this guy, with all his biases, he was right. I can do the same thing. And actually, and the other step in this case is actually, if you do the process and you learn how to do the experiment yourself, you can also try it, and eventually it's going to work for you too. So any individual bias that was there, in the end, the idea through the process of many people will have a view of it, is that bias will be overcome. So in this case, at the same, the fact that these teachers are on one hand spreading this knowledge through history, but on the other hand also they are practicing it, is at the same time doing the experiment, we can see. is testing the same thing that is theoretical, that you were saying, like it could be purely theoretical. It's testing the thing and testing the effects and the power of it. And actually, like yeah, I think we were talking before with Reshma before this, and the question was the point that was being raised is like, yeah, like how actually you can say that this experiment works. How you can test that this experiment works when actually the only witness for this is you. Like, how can you say that this knowledge is working if in the witness is in the end is something subjective, some internal change? I don't know. But actually, in this, we can again refer to the Bhagavad-gita. We can see that Arjuna actually is asking a similar question. Because in this case, in an experiment, if you do experiment, on one hand, you need to have your hypothesis. You need to have your proper experimental setup. And the important thing, the very important thing is that what's going to be the measure that you're going to use to acknowledge if this experiment is working or not. So if you're making an experiment where, I don't know, you're changing energy modifications in a system. Let's say, yeah, you use a thermometer, let's say, to measure the thing. So the kind of measurement that you're going to take, and you're going to use a thermometer and not, I don't know, well, energies can be anything. So, but you're going to use a thermometer and not a chronometer, let's say. There is going to be a particular measure that is fundamental to be able to say, okay, this experiment worked, this experiment didn't work. So in this case, when we are measuring this kind of a, let's say, internal changes, how are you going to measure it? How we will be able to say that this process is actually working? Because on one hand, it's an internal process, but which even there, what's going to be the measure? What's going to be the thing that we're going to follow in a time, let's say, to see how it's evolving? So, and that's actually one of the big problems that today, if you check in psychiatry, when people try to study how psychological processes are happening, yeah, many people say that, I don't know, like psychoanalysis is not scientific, because in that sense, it's difficult to come out with a measure of what's happening in your mind. And actually, you have a whole school of psychologists at the beginning of the 20th century that they were saying, yeah, we cannot measure those subjective things, so those subjective things don't exist. And you have the behavioralist like Skinner and etc., that these guys are basically saying, we only have to be, we're going to focus on just behavior, the things that we can measure, the things that we can observe, because all the subjective thing actually, what is that? How can we measure that? So ergo, we cannot measure, ergo doesn't exist. That was kind of the assumption over there. Again, going back to the initial point about what is science, or how we define what are facts, how we define what's knowledge. So these guys were saying, yeah, subjective things, we cannot touch them, so don't exist. But obviously later, new psychological schools came and they started to say, yeah, subjective things actually we can have experience, not in the same way that you measure, I don't know, a dog lifting a paw or something like that. But there's some other things that you can measure. And actually today, when we do a research in neuroscience, yeah, it's actually coming up with measures for the subjective things. And one of the initial things, one of the initial measures that you can have is, yes, just go and ask the people. Just go and ask people what's the processes that are happening inside them. So self-report is one of the measures in this case. But actually, just going back to Bhagavad-gita, Arjuna is asking the same question. And Arjuna is, because Krishna starts talking about someone who is enlightened and everything. And Arjuna asks, okay, but how can I know that someone is enlightened? How does he walk? How does he talk? Who's asking, Arjuna in the end is asking about something that tangible, some behavior. How can we say that these people or this process is actually working? And actually, what Krishna mentions in that case is naturally, it's not that it's going to walk in a funny way or it's going to talk in a particular way. No, what he says is that it's going to be, again, through behavior. And what's going to be the initial signal that this thing is working is that that person is capable of being stable in the world through different circumstances. So you have that the war is affecting our minds and ourselves in so many different ways that we are reacting just to this stimuli, and if something good happens, I'm happy. Something not so good happen, I'm depressed, and so on. But in this case, what the answer that Krishna is giving is that actually, if he is capable, if the person is capable of keeping this balance, that's a good measure that something is happening inside. So maybe we cannot have full understanding of what's the reasons, let's say, that that person has in mind to be able to behave in that way. But at least ourselves from outside, we can say, okay, whatever is happening inside the head of this person, something is there, or the process is giving some fruits. So yeah, so in that sense, I don't know if it helps to clarify that point, but in the end, when we were talking about facts, yeah, like to be able to characterize out something, one of the important things is to be able to identify which are the relevant facts to acknowledge or to account for those things. So yeah, but in one hand is, yeah, it's not completely, and again, it's not completely within the definition of what we currently, and in the mainstream, let's say, today we understand as empirical science. But there is some other accounts over there that, not because of that, because we cannot touch them, they don't have any value, let's say. So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Pradyumna. I just wanted to flag that there was another question that came in. Did you see your question got answered? Yeah. So there was another question that came in, which hopefully you'll be able to touch on as well. Is the Bhagavad-gita not biased toward one specific religion? That was the question.
Well, in that case, again, we need to go and try to understand what do we mean by religion in the end. What do we mean by religion in the end? Because, yeah, if religion is covering this, we can say, more particular aspects of backgrounds, geography, and etc., because we can see that how different traditions, we can say different religions, appear in different world, in different parts of the world, depending on the let's say requirements of that particular place. So if we by religion we're saying in this case that the Bhagavad-gita is arising in a particular place of the world, yeah, of course, it's in a particular place of the world, and the approach over there is in that context. But also it's very interesting. It's very interesting that, and especially from the translation that we have from the Bhagavad-gita to the English, that is the Prabhupada's translation, that we can say at the final point of the Bhagavad-gita, we have this statement from Krishna saying that in the end, the objective of this process that he is stating, the final objective is that you are able to get rid of all these religions and be able to just surrender to him. So in this case, what it means that? So we could may look that in the end you are, is over there is this statement that, as we were talking in this case, as religions are going to be these different denominations, different circumstances, different backgrounds, different types of aspects that are going to be depending on the individuals. But we can say that the Bhagavad-gita is targeting that behind all those different approaches, there is a common intent. And that intent in the end is, again, the idea of finding this primordial element. And in this case, we remember what's the way that is being referred Krishna as absolute truth. Again, from that perspective, the idea and the process that is exposed in the Bhagavad-gita in the end is try to highlight that despite those different circumstances, that approach towards that common goal, let's say, is something that is always possible, something that is not conditioned, and something that is not requiring, in this case, is not requiring, or is not dependent on those, let's say, particular circumstances. So in the end, the objective of all these different paths, of those different religions that are, that are being proposed in the Bhagavad-gita, we can say, different approaches, different ways, that the idea is, yeah, they're trying to target into the same point. But in the other hand, that point that is they are targeting is something that is, we can say, not relying on that, not relying on those possibilities that we have to be part of a particular religion, or this one or other. So in this case, and that's so interesting about the same approach that Prabhupada took, and in many statements that he made, you can also check this idea that in the end, that the idea is not just converting someone to a particular religion, or making them change. And actually, a Christian can keep being a Christian, a Muslim can keep being a Muslim, and etc. Because the acknowledgement that is being made in this case is that that common objective is present across all the different traditions, let's say, and also making the statement in this way that that common objective, that idea of looking for that one thing, that primordial thing, is something that is independent again from that starting points. We can see that that's common for to if we can put it like that, it's a common through any endeavor for a spiritual understanding. And in this case, we can use a spiritual understanding to try to, as this umbrella, to try to cover the other things. So yeah, I think I don't know if it was helpful, clarify it a little bit.
Can I ask something regarding that? Sorry.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, you know, like when we refer to religion, we have like the key distinctions of Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, like, and etc. But the fact that when we using the term Krishna consciousness, we're using the word Krishna, which is actually a god like a god in Hinduism. Mm-hmm. So isn't that in a way biased, like in the sense that we're not using the word God consciousness, for example, we're using a specific name, for example, Krishna. So mm-hmm. wouldn't that, even if it's not about converting someone, even someone from a different religion, even if they're trying to get into Krishna consciousness, they would have to use the word Krishna mm-hmm. in a sense. So in a way, even unknowingly, they're not converting, but they're like unknowingly using another terminology instead mm-hmm. of God, if that makes sense.
Well, in that case, we can take the opposite view and say that God itself is also a word that it has a particular, let's say, it's not a neutral word also. So in that sense, it has a whole history of proposing the concept. Because in the end, we can talk about Krishna, but also we can use Krishna as a token word. Let's say Krishna as referring to that. Because also we can go and ask ourselves what means Krishna, and Krishna in the end means that supreme attractive. So that supreme attractive in the end is another, we can say, a good way of referring to God, understanding God as some superior energy, superior entity, that in the end that's behind that word. But yeah, I think that your point is mostly made to the fact that the ways that we have to describing the way of the categories that we are using in the end maybe are more familiar for Hindu background, let's say. That's maybe what you're trying to refer?
Yeah.
That in the end, when we talk about Krishna, we're talking about a series of different parts that make sense from an elaboration that is coming from that Indian background, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about people that are atheist? Like they don't believe in God, but they might still be spiritually inclined. Wouldn't that still be a form of like spirituality, but not Krishna consciousness?
Well, if from that perspective, in this case, again, if we take atheist as yeah, because from that perspective, if we were talking about this idea of initial understanding of acknowledging at least one common thing, one truth, yeah, you can say that that's an initial understanding of what is spiritual. So you can say that, yeah, even when you're not, you don't acknowledge God as a person, you still can acknowledge God as this energy. But obviously, the way that you interact, the way that that person is going to interact with this, let's say, with this supreme energy is going to be, and the way that eventually they're going to interact with the other people, maybe is going to be informed by that initial assumption. But just going back to your point, yeah, because it's a very interesting thing, because in a way, we can ask which are the important concepts that we are covering through the philosophy that is exposed in the Bhagavad-gita. So let's say definitely the categories that are being presented in the Bhagavad-gita, yeah, they are using Sanskrit words, let's say. And the whole system it was created within that context. But we going back to the understanding something as a science, let's say. The idea of a science is you're proposing a structure. You're proposing this structure, and this structure, conceptual structure, theory, etc. The idea is that a structure is capable of capturing something that is happening in the world. It's capable. You can find some reflection. You can find an important thing within that structure, and we can go there and check, for example, that the theory of gravity was like as is studied certain point today was born in this context in England through the works of Newton. And obviously they're going to appear giving a particular set of a structure, a series of particularities, let's say, that were born in that particular context. And they were used in particular terms, particular words, etc. But the idea here that why that theoretical proposal is valuable is because in a way it's telling you something about the world despite the particular terms and the particular ways we have to describe it. It's telling you something about the universe. So we can try to do the same with the understanding that is presented in the Bhagavad-gita and check which are the structures that are presented over there, which are the categories that are being presented, and how those categories are trying to describe aspects of how we perceive the world, and in some other cases, how we, and that's another important thing, what's the, let's say, additional elements, let's say, since we are making this contrast, which are the additional elements that we are being proposed here, and why those elements are relevant. For example, let's take this understanding, like it's presented that this idea of God, as we were talking, is presented that this idea of God can be understood in different features, and this idea of God as Brahman, and this initial idea, as you were mentioning, like someone can have this this intuition that, yeah, like the supreme is just this energy, this immense energy that is going through all over the place, pervading everything. But yeah, that's an understanding, an understanding of a feature what God, what is this again, this God, what God is according to the Vedic proposal. But after that, you have this idea of Paramatma, the second feature. And through that feature, we are adding an extra ingredient, let's say. So from one hand, you have all the things that exist, but also you have, through that understanding, that individual, and maybe we can argue about or try to, at least this is how I understand it. Through that second feature, we are adding this component that is also part of how we perceive the world, that is not just one unique energy, but also you have this, to a certain degree, this individuality. Let's say in the world, at least, there is two things: you and the world. It's yourself, the observer, the one who experiences, the one who knows, and the rest of existence. At least you have those two things. And later, you have this other understanding of feature of what this supreme, this totality means. And you have Bhagavan. And with Bhagavan, you are adding this extra ingredient, let's say, that is, why do we all this, what in the end, overall, we are doing this? And in this case, it's because we want to obtain pleasure, because we want to be happy. So that's something, an ingredient additional to the fact that things exist, because everything could exist and be completely passive. It's additional to the concept that, okay, we have two things that exist. It's us, and it's at least us, and the rest of the rest of the things, and also from that, the rest of people, and etc. So that's another component. But all those things could be completely passive. Why any interaction, anything would being sparked at all? And that's the fact that, yeah, there is this initial desire for enjoyment, to be happy. So, okay, again, those categories, you can say, yeah, those categories are being framed depending on this particular Sanskrit words, etc., etc. But again, we can ask ourselves if those categories are giving us some relevant understanding about how let's say, reality, or how the world is being, or how we can take the world, how we can perceive or try to interact with the world. Okay, that's, hopefully that was helpful. Sorry if I wasn't able to cover completely the answer.
Great. Thank you, Prady.